China, South Korea, France, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Russia, France, Germany, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, France, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Thailand, Thailand, Malaysia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, South United Kingdom, South Korea, United States, Thailand, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Korea, Germany, Ukraine, South Korea, Japan, Japan, China, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Korea, Thailand, France, Vietnam, Germany, South Korea, Singapore, Philippines, Germany, Germany, South Korea, Singapore, Russia, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, China, Germany, South Korea, France, South Korea, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, China, South Korea, Germany,
Japan, Nigeria,
Germany,
France, Mexico, Korea, Poland,
Vietnam, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Korea, France, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Vietnam, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, Germany, France, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, France, China, Russia, Indonesia, Indonesia, France, Indonesia, France, Philippines, United States, India, Philippines, Ukraine, France, Russia, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, India, Thailand, Japan, Malaysia,
Kenya, Italy,
India,
Cuba, Iran,
Indonesia,
Spain, Kenya, Norway, Ukraine, Italy,
Singapore,
Cuba, Turkey, Argentina, Belgium, India, Morocco,
Japan,
Finland, Israel, Pakistan, Jamaica, Argentina, Morocco, Belgium, India, Pakistan,
Thailand,
Israel, Netherlands,
South Korea,
Tunisia, United States, Qatar, Colombia,
Germany,
Tunisia, Netherlands, Serbia, Colombia, Hungary, United States,
Japan, South Korea,
Denmark, Algeria, Iran, Romania, Philippines, Ireland,
South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine,
Austria, South Africa, Belarus, Cambodia, Slovakia,
South Korea,
Bangladesh, Austria, China, South Africa,
South Korea,
Uruguay,
Japan,
Cambodia, Bangladesh,
South Korea, Russia,
Nepal, Iceland, Ecuador,
China, South Korea,
Saudi Arabia,
United Kingdom,
Nepal,
South Korea, China, South Korea,
Venezuela, Greece,
South Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea,
Australia, Armenia,
Russia,
Taiwan, Pakistan, Latvia, Estonia, Uzbekistan,
Russia,
Kazakhstan, Taiwan, Australia, Palestine, Armenia,
United Kingdom,
Uzbekistan, Estonia, Latvia,
Ukraine, Philippines, Thailand, Japan. Japan. Indonesia. Russia. Germany. Vietnam. Malaysia. Malaysia. Japan. Ukraine. Germany. 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 Ukraine. United Kingdom. Indonesia. Indonesia. Malaysia. United Kingdom. Japan. Russia. China. United States. Ukraine. Germany. Malaysia. United Kingdom. France. United Kingdom. Singapore. Russia. Germany. South Korea. United States. Malaysia. United States. South Korea. South Korea. United States. South Korea. Indonesia. South Korea. Vietnam. South Korea. South Korea. France. South Korea. South Korea. Ukraine. Japan. South Korea. China. Russia. South Korea. Russia. South Korea. Russia. South Korea. Russia. Russia. South Korea. Singapore. Russia. United States. Russia. South Korea. France. Russia. France. Russia. South Korea. Russia. South Korea. Russia. South Korea. France. South Korea. South Korea. Thailand. South Korea. Japan. Japan. South Korea. South Korea. China. South Korea. South Korea. South Korea. South Korea. Singapore. South Korea. South Korea. France. South Korea. South Korea. Thailand, Thailand, South Korea, South Korea, Japan, Germany, United States, South Korea, Japan, France, South Korea, United States, Japan, Japan, South Korea, United States, South Korea, Germany, United States, United Kingdom, United States, Italy, Ukraine, South Korea, United States, Germany, United States, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, France, South Korea, Germany, United States, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, United States, Japan, Ukraine, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, France, United States, Vietnam, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, Ukraine, Japan, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, United States, South Korea, Philippines, France, Ukraine, South Korea, China, South Korea, United States, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia, Ukraine, South Korea, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, South Korea, United States, Russia, South Korea, China, South Korea, South Vietnam, Russia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Russia, United Kingdom, South Korea, Russia, 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 South Korea, Ukraine, Singapore, South Korea, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, South Korea, Russia, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, China, Russia, Japan, South Korea, Russia, Malaysia, Russia, Russia, Germany, South Korea, Russia, Japan, Russia, Thailand, Russia, Russia, Thailand, Russia, South Korea, Russia, Germany, Russia, Indonesia, Russia, Ukraine, Russia, United Russia, Japan, Russia, Malaysia, Russia, Japan, Germany, Malaysia, Vietnam, United Kingdom, United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, Thailand, Russia, Ukraine, Russia, Russia, Austria, Russia, Malaysia, Russia, China, Russia, Japan, Russia, Russia, China, Brazil, Russia,
Sweden,
Singapore,
Brazil, France, Japan, Nigeria,
Vietnam, Russia, Russia, Poland, Russia, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, Brazil, South Korea, Russia, Indonesia, Russia,
Spain, Kenya,
Russia,
Turkey,
Russia,
Cuba,
Brazil,
Spain,
Ukraine,
Norway,
Russia,
Italy,
Brazil, Singapore, Russia,
Argentina, Belgium, India, Morocco, Finland, Israel, Pakistan,
Malaysia,
Belgium, Pakistan, Jamaica, Finland, Israel,
Russia,
Serbia,
United States, Brazil,
Hungary, Colombia, Austria,
Russia,
Netherlands, Serbia,
Philippines,
Colombia,
Brazil, Russia, United States, Brazil, Russia, Vietnam, South Korea, Russia, United States, Russia, 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 South Korea, Russia, Brazil, Russia, Japan, Brazil, South Korea, Serbia, Thailand, Germany, Brazil, Singapore, Serbia, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan,
Latvia, Estonia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Taiwan,
Philippines,
Pakistan,
Russia, Germany, Brazil, South Korea, Ukraine, Thailand, Brazil, China, Brazil, France, Indonesia, United Kingdom, Thailand, United States, Russia, China, Germany, South Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Malaysia, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, France, Czechia, Ukraine, South Korea, France, Czechia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Czechia, Philippines, United States, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, Czechia, United States, Czechia, South Korea, Czechia, Indonesia, Czechia, South Czechia, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, 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 Japan, South Korea, South Vietnam, Ukraine, South Korea, South Korea, Czechia, Germany, South Korea, Czechia, South Czechia, France, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Czechia, South Korea, Czechia, South Korea, United Czechia, South Korea, Czechia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, South Czechia, France, South Korea, Czechia, South Korea, Czechia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, France, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Vietnam, Germany, South United Kingdom, Russia, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, United States, Singapore, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, South Korea, China, South Korea, United States, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, China, South Korea, Singapore, South Korea, France, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Philippines, China, France, South Korea, United States, Thailand, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, China, South Korea, Malaysia, Malaysia, South Korea, United Kingdom, Russia, United Kingdom, Malaysia, Ukraine, Malaysia, Malaysia, United States, Malaysia, Japan, Malaysia, Ukraine, Russia, Malaysia, 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 China, Malaysia, Russia, South Russia, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Russia, Japan, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, Russia, Philippines, Russia, Philippines, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, France, Russia, Dominican Republic, Russia, Germany, Russia, Russia, Germany, South Korea, Russia, Russia, Vietnam, Russia, Germany, Russia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Russia, Russia, Japan, Russia, Russia, China, South Korea, Russia, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, South Russia, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Russia, Ukraine, Russia, South Korea, South China, South Korea, South Korea, France, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, France, South Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, South Korea, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Russia, Russia, South Korea, Russia, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, China, South Korea, Russia, Indonesia, Russia, South Korea, China, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, Philippines, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, Russia, China, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Russia, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, Russia, Germany, South Korea, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, France, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Singapore, South Korea, South Vietnam, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, South Korea, Russia, Germany, Russia, United States, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, China, South Russia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, United Russia, South Korea, South Russia, Vietnam, Russia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Vietnam, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Germany, Indonesia, South Korea, Argentina, South Vietnam, Vietnam, Russia, Indonesia, South Vietnam, United South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia, South China, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Indonesia, China, South Korea, Indonesia, United Indonesia, South Korea, South Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, France, South Korea, France, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, South Japan, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, China, South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, China, South United States, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Bolivia, South Korea, China, South Korea, Indonesia, Bolivia, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, Bolivia, South Korea, South India, South Korea, South Korea, South Bolivia, India, Bolivia, France, South Korea, Bolivia, South Korea, Bolivia, India, South Korea, India, South Korea, South Korea, India, Bolivia, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, South Kenya, South Korea, India, India, South Korea, Russia, India, South Korea, India, India, Thailand, Kenya, India, India, South France, Kenya, India, India, South Singapore, Kenya, India, South Korea, China, Kenya, South India, United Kingdom, South Korea, India, South Korea, India, Kenya, South Korea, India, Japan, South Korea, Kenya, India, Ukraine, South Korea, Kenya, India, South Korea, India, Kenya, South Korea, India, South Korea, Kenya, India, Yemen, South Korea, South India, Thailand, Kenya, South Korea, Kenya, India, South Korea, Kenya, South Korea, Kenya, South Korea, India, Kenya, Malaysia, South India, South Korea, South India, South Korea, South Korea, South Malaysia, South Korea, Canada, India, South Korea, Kenya, South India, Ukraine, South Korea, Kenya, India, Russia, India, Canada, India, Kenya, Thailand, India, Kenya, South Korea, Kenya, Canada, India, Kenya, South Korea, Indonesia, India, Canada, Thailand, Canada, India, South Canada, Thailand, Canada, Cuba, South Korea, France, South Israel, Japan, Cuba, South Korea, Singapore, Cuba, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Israel, South Korea, China, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia, Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, United States, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Egypt, Germany, China, Indonesia, Thailand, South Palestine, Japan, Malaysia, France, Indonesia, United States, Malaysia, United States,
Nepal, Iceland,
United States,
Venezuela, Kuwait, Croatia, Saudi Arabia,
Indonesia,
Iceland, Croatia, Saudi Arabia,
United Philippines,
Venezuela,
Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, Russia, Philippines, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, China, South Africa, Japan, France, Philippines, Ukraine, Philippines, Germany, Japan, France, Philippines, Indonesia, China, Japan, Indonesia, United States, South Indonesia, Japan, United Kingdom, Philippines, Japan, Philippines, Thailand, Japan, Philippines, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, China, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, United Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, Ukraine, Australia, Argentina, Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, France, South Korea, United Kingdom, Philippines, United States, Philippines, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Philippines, South Korea, United Kingdom, Israel, Ukraine, Philippines, Thailand, Philippines, Japan, Philippines, Bangladesh, Germany, Philippines, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Belgium, Ukraine, United States, South Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Philippines, South Philippines, Russia, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Philippines, Philippines, Malaysia, Uruguay, South Korea, Singapore, Ukraine, Germany,
Denmark, Algeria, Iraq, Romania,
United Kingdom, Philippines, Japan, Germany, Argentina, Ukraine, Germany, South Korea, Russia, Brazil, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Korea, Singapore, South Korea, Ukraine, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Singapore, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, China, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Pakistan, South Korea, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Japan, Indonesia, Japan, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, India, Japan, Japan, India, India, South Japan, India, South Korea, South Korea, India, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, China, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, China, South Japan, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, China, Japan, Russia, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, Ukraine, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Russia, Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, United Kingdom, Philippines, Japan, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan, Japan, Indonesia, Indonesia, Japan, South Philippines, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, Indonesia, Indonesia, Japan, Indonesia, 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 Philippines,
Latvia, Estonia,
Malaysia,
Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan,
Philippines,
Taiwan, Australia, Palestine, Armenia,
Vietnam,
Kazakhstan,
Japan,
Uzbekistan, Estonia, Latvia,
South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Japan, China, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, United States, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Japan, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom, Germany, Indonesia, Indonesia, France, Malaysia, South Korea, Malaysia, Malaysia, Ukraine, Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, Malaysia, Philippines, Poland, Malaysia, Japan, Indonesia, Indonesia, Malaysia, 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 Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Malaysia, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Indonesia, United States, Malaysia, South Korea, South Korea, Malaysia, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Indonesia, Ukraine, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Malaysia, South Korea, Singapore, Malaysia, 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 Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Germany, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Germany, Indonesia, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Germany, Malaysia, Thailand, Malaysia, France, Malaysia, South Indonesia, Germany, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indonesia, France, Indonesia, Malaysia, Ukraine, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Indonesia, Malaysia, United States, Indonesia, Chile, France, United States, Indonesia, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Russia, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, China, Indonesia, South Korea, Ukraine,
Cuba, Turkey,
Russia, India, Indonesia, Ukraine, Indonesia, Indonesia, China, India, India, Thailand, India, India, Indonesia, United Kingdom, Vietnam, Indonesia, Indonesia, India, India, Indonesia, India, Indonesia, France, India, United States, Vietnam, China, India, India, Philippines, Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, France, India, Russia, India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Germany, Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Ukraine, South Korea, India, Russia, Bangladesh, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, India, South Korea, India, South Korea, India, South Korea, India, Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam, India, Japan, India, Thailand, South Korea, India, South Korea, South India, South Korea, South India, South Korea, South Korea, India, Japan, South Korea, South India, Philippines, India, Vietnam, Japan, India, France, India, France, India, France, Russia, South Korea, India, France, South Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom,
Japan, Nigeria,
South Japan, United States, South Korea, South Korea, Philippines, India, South Korea, China, South Korea, Malaysia, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Ukraine, South Thailand, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Thailand, United States, South Korea, France, Japan, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, Japan, United Kingdom, South Korea, France, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Japan, Philippines, South Korea, France, South Korea, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, Japan, Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, China, Japan, Russia, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Japan, South Korea, United Kingdom, Japan, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Pakistan, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Japan, Russia, Pakistan, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, United States, Japan, Pakistan, South Korea, Japan, France, Japan, Pakistan, Singapore, South Korea, Canada, Ukraine, Philippines, Japan, Pakistan, Russia, Japan, Canada, South Korea, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, Pakistan, United Japan, Canada, South Korea, China, South Korea, Pakistan, South Korea, Pakistan, Japan, Pakistan, South Korea, Pakistan, South Philippines, Canada, Japan, Thailand, Pakistan, Japan, Pakistan, South China, Japan, South Korea, France, Japan, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, South Pakistan, Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, Germany, South Japan, Japan, South Korea, Canada, Japan, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, United Kingdom, South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Japan, Japan, Pakistan, South Pakistan, Thailand, Pakistan, Germany, Pakistan, Russia, Pakistan, Singapore, Pakistan, Russia, South Korea, United States, Malaysia, Japan, United States, Malaysia, United States, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Germany, Japan, China, Japan, Germany, Japan, China, Japan, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, United States, Malaysia, United States, Thailand, Germany, France, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Ukraine, United States, United States, United South Korea, United States, United South Korea, South Korea, Philippines, South Korea, United States, Malaysia, United States, South Korea, United South Japan, United States, Ukraine, United States, South Korea, United States, South Korea, Mexico, United States, South Korea, 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 Mexico, Thailand, Russia, Nigeria, Philippines, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, China, China, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Thailand, China, China, United Kingdom, South Korea, South Korea, Germany, Malaysia, China, South Korea, Japan, South Korea, China, China, South Korea, China, Japan, China, France, China, South Korea, South Korea, Germany, South Korea, Indonesia, China, South Korea, Philippines, Russia, Indonesia, Thailand, South Korea, Philippines, United States, China, Germany, Russia, Bangladesh, France, China, China, Philippines, Bangladesh, China, Thailand, China, France, China, China, Russia, China, China, Bangladesh, Indonesia, China, Bangladesh, China, China, Bangladesh, China, Bangladesh, China, Singapore, China, Bangladesh, Philippines, China, Singapore, India, Bangladesh, China, China, Bangladesh, China, India, China, India, Singapore, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Bangladesh, South Korea, India, China, Russia, Japan, India, Bangladesh, China, India, China, India, China, South Korea, India, China, Japan, China, India, China, Indonesia, India, India, Japan, France, India, South Korea, Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Russia, South Korea, India, South Korea, France, India, South Korea, United States, India, South Korea, Indonesia, India, China, Germany, India, South Korea, India, Japan, France, India, China, Philippines, China, India, United Kingdom, China, Japan, China, France, China, India, South Korea, India, India, Germany, China, India, China, 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 India, China, France, China, Japan, China, Indonesia, China, Philippines, China, United Kingdom, China, Russia, India, Japan, Ukraine,
Nigeria,
India,
France,
China, China, India,
Poland, Egypt,
India,
Vietnam,
Indonesia,
Sweden, Chile, Brazil, France, Japan,
Japan,
Nigeria,
Vietnam,
Mexico,
India,
Poland,
South Korea,
Brazil, Nigeria, France, Japan, Mexico,
Indonesia,
Korea, Egypt,
India,
Poland, Brazil, France, Nigeria,
Russia, South Korea, South Korea, Thailand, South Korea, South Korea,
Thailand, Peru,
United States,
Ukraine, Spain, Italy,
South Korea,
Iran, Spain,
France,
Norway, Ukraine, Italy, Iran, Cuba, Turkey, Argentina,
Philippines,
India, Morocco, Finland, Israel,
South Korea,
Argentina, Morocco,
Philippines,
India, Pakistan, Jamaica,
South Korea,
Finland, Israel, Netherlands, Libya, Laos,
Indonesia,
United States, Qatar, Colombia, Laos, Tunisia, Netherlands, Libya,
Germany,
Colombia,
United
Uganda,
States,
United
South
States,
Korea, South Korea,
Denmark,
France,
Algeria, Iraq, Romania, Philippines, Ireland, Bolivia, Denmark, Uganda,
Japan,
Algeria, Ireland, Bolivia, Romania, Philippines,
Germany,
China, Uruguay, Austria, South Africa, Belarus,
South Korea,
Slovakia,
Thailand,
Austria, China,
South Korea,
Uruguay, Cambodia, Bangladesh,
China, United, South Korea, France, Ukraine,
Iceland, Croatia, Saudi Arabia,
South Korea, United States, South Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, China, Japan,
Armenia, Taiwan, Palestine,
Malaysia, Brazil, United States, France, United States, India, Ukraine, New Zealand, Germany, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Philippines, Ukraine, United States, Philippines, United States, South Korea, Brazil, United States, South Korea, France, Malaysia, Japan, Germany, Germany,
Portugal, Denmark,
China,
Algeria,
Vietnam,
Iraq, Romania,
Germany,
Israel, Bolivia, Denmark, Portugal, Iraq, Algeria,
Vietnam,
Bolivia, Romania, Philippines,
United Germany,
Austria, South Africa,
United States,
Belarus, Cambodia, Slovakia, Bangladesh, Austria,
Singapore,
South Africa,
United Germany,
Uruguay, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Belarus,
Indonesia,
Slovakia,
Germany, South Korea, Germany, Germany, Russia, Turkey, Germany, United States, China, United States, Japan, Germany, Germany, India, Thailand, Germany, France, Germany, Russia, Germany, Germany, Australia, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France, Australia, Germany, Singapore, Germany, Germany, Japan, Germany, France, Germany, Ukraine, Germany, Vietnam, Germany, China, United Kingdom, Ukraine, Argentina, Ukraine, Japan, Thailand, Malaysia, India, Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, China, Iran, South Korea, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, China, Brazil, Ukraine, South Korea, France, Australia, Brazil, China, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, Australia, South Korea, Brazil, Australia, Thailand, South Korea, Brazil, Indonesia, Australia, Brazil, South Korea, United Brazil, Australia, Brazil, Australia, South Korea, Brazil, Japan, Australia, United States, Australia, Brazil, Russia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea, Brazil, Australia, South Korea, South Korea, South Korea.